Dawn drags its pale fingernails across the clapboard roofs of Charleston 1847, and the Whitmore house exhales a cold, perfumed lie. From the street you'd swear it is holiness, white columns bathed in pearl light wreaths, stitched with velvet ribbon, a door polished to a priest's mirror. But push past the threshold and you'll hear it, the quiet rhythm of chains disguised as chores. In the back, where the light never quite lands, a stove growls like a caged thing, and Miriam Carter wakes to its iron breath. For 28 winters she has fed this house simmering broth that hides a bruise, folding sugar into obedience, ladling silence onto plates stamped with Europe. Her hands are a ledger of what has been taken from her, a scar where a kettle leapt a whitened knuckle from squeezing prayer into bone, a hollow where a daughter's name used to live. Jonathan Whitmore boasts of his table. Eleanor Whitmore bargains with her reflection, and Miriam, the unseen author of their splendor, measures a different arithmetic by the weight of grief in her chest. Christmas week fattens the city with music and gossip. Laurel garlands drip from banisters like green serpents. Invitations shine like knives. Somewhere between the oysters and the hymn, between the governor's handshake and the stable boy's cough, something in the kitchen catches flame, an idea small as a matchhead, bright as judgment. By the time the bells ring, Charleston will learn that the sweetest course can carry the bitterest truth. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The hour matters in stories like this. The Whitmore estate crouched on East Bay Street like a lion in repose, white columns gleaming against the dark waters of the harbor. To Charleston's elite, the house was a beacon of refinement, a place where politics and power were lubricated with Madeira wine and sweetened with candied fruits. To those trapped inside its walls, it was a coffin carved in ivory. Miriam Carter had been brought here as a girl of 14, traded at auction for her gift with spices. 28 years later, her mastery of the kitchen had grown legendary. Men in frock coats lifted glasses in her honor without ever once speaking her name. Women praised the delicate genius of the meals while treating the cook herself as an animated piece of furniture. Miriam had learned early that invisibility was both curse and weapon. Yet invisibility had not spared her grief. She bore 3 children in that house. The first, a boy named Thomas, was sold at 7 to cover Jonathan Whitmore's gambling debt. The second, Lydia, was sent away on her 10th birthday, a gift to Jonathan's cousin in Georgia. The third never drew breath beyond a single night. Each loss hollowed Miriam's body until she was more memory than flesh, more ache than woman. She found fragments of kinship in others. Ezekiel Grant, the stable hand stooped with age, had been there longer than anyone. He remembered Miriam's mother, remembered her laughter before sickness claimed her. His hands trembled now, but his eyes still carried embers of defiance. When the overseer raised a whip, Ezekiel's glance alone told the younger ones survive, even if dignity must hide for now. And there was Naomi, just 13, with eyes too old for her narrow shoulders. She worked beside Miriam in the kitchen, scrubbing pots until her small hands blistered. Naomi's sister Clara had been marked for sale, another debt payment. The girl wept in her sleep, thin shoulders quaking as if the night itself beat her. Miriam listened, every sob carving a canyon inside her chest. She had lived through it before, through her own children's departures, and she knew the sound of a heart tearing loose. Mistress Eleanor Whitmore drifted through these halls like a frost. Draped in silks imported from London, she spoke in a clipped voice that could splinter bone. She complained of fingerprints on china, of wrinkles in linens, of bread baked too brown or not enough. Her cruelty was not fiery like her husband's, but glacial, slow, suffocating, eroding piece by piece until resistance froze into silence. Jonathan Whitmore's violence was of another breed. His rages came in floods, a shattered goblet against the hearth, a drunken hand wandering beneath Miriam's scarf, the sudden dismissal of a boy, too old to be cute, but too young to be strong. He was both master and beast, feared in equal measure by the servants and his peers. His debts at the gambling table were as notorious as his Christmas balls, and both were paid in human coin. The kitchen was Miriam's only dominion. The mortar and pestle beat like her second heart. Knives obeyed her as soldiers obey a general. Yet even here, freedom was an illusion. Eleanor inspected the plates. Jonathan appeared without warning, and the overseer prowled the back halls. Still, within the hiss of boiling pots, Miriam found a kind of coded language. The crack of bread crust, the sting of vinegar, the hum of spices, these became her scripture. She thought often of the oak trees that lined the drive, their branches crooked like gallows. Only last spring, a runaway had been strung from one of them, his body left swaying as a sermon to the others. The roots of those trees drank sorrow and blood, and Miriam swore sometimes she could hear them whisper in the night. She wondered if, like her, the trees remembered every scream, every bargain, every betrayal. It was during the approach to Christmas, when the mansion bristled with garlands and candles, that Miriam's grief sharpened into something steel-like. Clara was sold, her small wrists bound in rope as she was led away. Naomi's cry echoed across the yard, a sound that clawed the sky itself. Ezekiel told Miriam, voice low as embers, "They'll bleed us till nothing's left." His words were not prophecy, but fact. That night Miriam pressed her palms into the coarse blanket of her cot, the silence around her heavy as stone. She realized she had crossed an invisible threshold. Suffering had fermented into something darker, a vintage that could no longer be bottled. Hatred, yes, but also clarity. She remembered a saying whispered by the elders long ago: the kitchen can feed or it can kill, and only the cook decides which story will be served. Miriam had never dared test the truth of those words. But the seed was there, hidden as surely as the small box beneath her floorboard, waiting for the season to ripen. As she listened to Naomi's muffled sobs, as she watched Ezekiel limp across the yard, as she heard Jonathan's laughter muffled by brandy, Miriam felt the seed stir. Charleston's great houses feasted on the bones of people like her, gilded their wealth with her labor, fattened their reputations with her recipes. But every feast could curdle, every banquet could be spoiled. And in the shadows of the kitchen, beneath the wreaths and the carols, a woman once invisible began to imagine herself as something more, a reckoning dressed in an apron, a vengeance steeped in cinnamon and wine. The roots of hatred had deepened into something immovable. And when roots hold fast, storms cannot help but follow. Charleston's streets swelled with carriages that December, their iron wheels crunching against cobblestones slick with winter damp. Inside the Whitmore mansion, ribbons unfurled across banisters and chandeliers dripped with waxen light as servants prepared for the ball. To the city's elite, the spectacle promised laughter music and the delicate hand of Miriam Carter shaping flavors into miracles. To Miriam herself, it promised one more night of humiliation unless she chose otherwise. The spark came not with thunder, but with the smallest of sounds, the breaking of a child's sob. Naomi had clung to her sister Clara the evening before the sale, her small arms straining as though flesh could hold against commerce. But rope and coin proved stronger. Clara was pulled away in the yard while Jonathan Whitmore's laughter clattered like dice in a gambler's cup. Naomi screamed until her throat was raw, until she collapsed into Miriam's lap like a ragged doll. And Miriam, who had lived through this loss before, felt something inside her calcify. She had buried children, buried hope, buried years, but she would not bury Naomi's cries as well. That night she waited until the house groaned itself into silence. From beneath her pallet she pulled a wooden box weathered by sweat and years. Wrapped in faded cloth lay a packet of powder, the color of ground bone. It had been given to her long ago by old Mother Ruth, a root woman who whispered to the enslaved about herbs that healed and herbs that killed. "Keep it," the woman had murmured, pressing the packet into Miriam's palm. "For the day suffering grows too wide for your skin." For decades Miriam had kept it untouched, half relic, half threat. Now, with Naomi weeping beside her, the powder seemed to glow in the moonlight. She touched it gently, as one might touch the edge of a blade. Fear slid down her spine, but fear no longer mattered. What was one more lash, one more loss, one more scar? They had already stripped her life to the marrow. Perhaps this powder was not death, but a form of balance. The next morning she walked into the kitchen as if nothing had changed, yet every movement carried a new edge. She crushed herbs with unusual force, each strike of the pestle echoing like a drumbeat in her chest. She measured spices as though composing equations, as though each pinch of cinnamon could one day become a calculation of justice. Jonathan entered half-drunk, demanding that her famous oyster stew be flawless for Governor Pierce. His hand lingered on her shoulder, his breath sour with whiskey. Once she might have trembled. Now she looked past him as though he were already a ghost. That afternoon she conducted her first test. In the herb shed behind the garden, a stray cat prowled, ribs sharp as daggers beneath its fur. Miriam mixed a sliver of powder into broth and slid the bowl toward the animal. Within hours the cat lay trembling, its body seized with sickness. By morning it staggered to its feet, alive but weak. Miriam exhaled relief and terror mingling in her lungs. She repeated the test with a larger measure 2 days later. This time the cat slept for a full day before waking. The third trial, double the second, proved fatal within hours. The creature's stillness was both confirmation and warning. She buried it beneath the rosemary bush, whispering, "Forgive me. Your death will not be wasted." Knowledge hardened into resolve. Miriam began committing doses to memory with the precision of recipes. A pinch could sicken, a spoon could silence forever. The powder bore no scent, only the faintest bitterness, easily disguised by wine or sugar. In holiday feasts swollen with nutmeg, cloves, and rum, no tongue would discern its presence. The kitchen, once her prison, had become her armory. At night she lay awake, thoughts flaring like sparks in a forge. Should she strike only Jonathan, Eleanor, and the overseer, or the wider circle of Charleston's masters and judges who would gather for the Christmas ball. She weighed vengeance against risk, compassion against fury, but every memory tipped the scales. Thomas torn from her arms, Lydia crying as she vanished into a wagon, Ezekiel's stooped body absorbing lashes meant to kill, Naomi's tears wetting her sleeve. Mercy had no place here. The banquet would be their altar, and the meal her scripture. Yet even vengeance had to be crafted with care. Suspicion could not fall upon her alone. She began planting seeds of deception. She spoke of aching joints to the other servants, of weariness from long years in the kitchen. She slowed her movements deliberately when Mistress Eleanor hovered, rubbing her wrists as though inflamed. "You'll not collapse before the ball," Eleanor snapped one morning. Miriam bowed her head, murmuring, "Yes, mistress," hiding the cold fire burning in her chest. She also thought of Naomi. The girl was fragile, half-starved with grief. Miriam knew investigations would follow the ball, whips lashing for confessions, bodies broken for answers. Naomi could not survive such scrutiny. Miriam decided the girl must escape. In the shadows of the kitchen yard, she whispered to Daniel Green, the young stable hand loyal to Ezekiel's memory. After the ball, she said, "There will be chaos. Take Naomi north. Find the marsh people. They know paths to freedom." Daniel's eyes widened in fear, but he nodded slowly. "For Ezekiel," he said, "and for Clara." The plan grew in her mind like ivy, weaving through every corridor of the mansion. Each dish became a vessel, each goblet a chalice for her wrath. For the delicate Miss Sinclair, who required plain chicken, she imagined a smaller dose, enough to summon illness to distract the crowd. For Jonathan, the overseer, Parsons, Judge Wallace, Doctor, Alcott, the architects of torment, she reserved the full measure, a draft to end their dominion. On the Sunday before Christmas, Miriam sat alone in the dark kitchen after the others had gone. She held the packet in her hands, whispering names into the powder like prayers. Thomas, Lydia, Ezekiel, Clara. For each name a pinch, for each life stolen a reckoning. She felt no joy, only a grim serenity, as though she were finally walking the path carved for her since girlhood. The city glittered in preparation for the ball, oblivious. Carriages rolled past, candles gleamed in shop windows, choirs sang hymns of mercy and peace. Yet Miriam knew mercy had long abandoned Charleston. Only justice remained bitter, as wormwood sharp as the knife she honed on the whetstone. The spark had become flame. What began as a sob in the night had ignited an inferno in Miriam's soul. There would be no turning back, no forgiveness left to give. The Christmas ball would not be a celebration, it would be a reckoning carved into history, one dish at a time. The Whitmore mansion transformed as Christmas drew near, its every corner swelling with finery purchased on the backs of misery. Laurel garlands hung heavy across banisters, perfumed candles crowded the mantels, and the ballroom's chandeliers blazed so brightly that even at dusk the street outside glimmered with borrowed daylight. To the neighbors, it was evidence of Jonathan Whitmore's resilience, proof that despite whispered debts, he remained Charleston's consummate host. To Miriam Carter, it was the stage upon which she would perform her last and only true act of authorship. The kitchen became her theater of operations. Fires roared from dawn until midnight. Copper pots hissed with boiling stock, and every surface carried the aroma of impending feast. Oysters shucked into silver bowls, ducks plucked and rubbed with cloves, hams cured and glazed to a mahogany sheen. Eleanor Whitmore hovered like a vulture in silk, fingering the china for smudges, chastising Naomi for missing a speck of ash on a pewter spoon. Miriam bowed her head, hands moving with dutiful speed, but her mind traced an altogether different choreography. Each dish was assigned its hidden role. Each goblet was measured not only for wine, but for the bitter dust she alone could see. In the privacy of the herb shed, she continued her testing. She had buried the last of the stray cats, their deaths recorded in the silent ledger of her resolve. Now she ground herbs with deliberate clamor whenever Eleanor lingered nearby, masking her real work, tiny paper twists marked with invisible scratches, each containing a carefully weighed portion of the powder. Some would sicken, some would kill. She folded them into her apron's secret pocket, close against her body, as though keeping company with the children stolen from her arms. Daniel Green, faithful in his quiet strength, carried firewood into the kitchen one evening and found Miriam waiting. "The girl must leave during the ball," she whispered, glancing toward Naomi, who scrubbed dishes until her knuckles bled. "There will be shouting, confusion, maybe flames. Take her to the marsh settlement. From there, the path runs north." Daniel's eyes searched hers for hesitation but found none. "For Ezekiel," he said, voice steady. "I'll see her safe." That night, Miriam slipped Naomi half her ration of cornmeal and a silver spoon taken from Eleanor's drawer, a single piece of currency that might barter survival. Naomi did not yet know the full plan, but Miriam's embrace told her enough that she would not face the road alone. The mansion pulsed with rehearsals of splendor. Musicians arrived to tune violins. Seamstresses delivered gowns stitched with foreign lace. Jonathan barked orders already flushed with brandy before noon. Governor Pierce had accepted the invitation he boasted, as had Judge Wallace and Dr. Alcott, men whose names spelled terror in slave quarters. "This ball," Jonathan declared, slicing ham from the kitchen board without asking, "will set me upon the Harbor Commission. Charleston will know the Whitmores stand untouchable." He chewed noisily, fat dripping into his beard, oblivious to the hatred congealing in the cook who bowed before him. 10 days before the ball, Miriam discovered another ally oil of bitter almonds delivered from the apothecary for Eleanor's marzipan confections. Its fragrance, sharp and almost poisonous, resembled the faint trace of her hidden powder. Should suspicion arise, she could point to this legitimate ingredient. She marveled at the irony that Eleanor's vanity would provide the perfect cloak for vengeance. At night, Miriam rehearsed the performance in her mind. Miss Sinclair, the fragile guest with her delicate digestion, would receive a plate set apart chicken plain vegetables, unseasoned yet carrying a dose precise enough to unmoor her body without ending it. The girl's collapse would scatter the guest's composure, distract eyes from the greater blow to come. Then, during dessert, Miriam herself would appear in the dining room with flaming pudding and governor's punch. The spectacle would mask her final sleight of hand, and the rim of Jonathan's goblet would glitter with death. Outside, the winter air sharpened with frost and the oaks groaned beneath the weight of memories. Miriam walked once among them, touching the scarred bark of the tree where a runaway had dangled last spring. She whispered no prayer, only a promise. Soon the roots would drink richer offerings than mere blood. Soon the soil itself would remember her name. The servants began to notice her feigned ailments. She rubbed her wrists with theatrical winces, slowed her steps when carrying wood. "Don't you dare fail me before the ball," Eleanor warned, eyes narrowed. Miriam bent her head, murmuring, "Yes, mistress," even as her heart counted beats like war drums. Every gesture of weariness was a stitch in her alibi, each groan another layer of camouflage. 5 days before Christmas, Jonathan demanded his famous rum punch be included. Strong enough to floor a governor, he grinned, clapping Miriam on the shoulder with drunken familiarity. She nodded, eyes lowered to hide their blaze. The punch would be her crowning stroke, a sweet tidal wave under which the masters of Charleston would drown. Naomi grew thinner with each passing day, a wraith moving through her chores. Miriam shielded her where she could, keeping her close in the kitchen to avoid the overseer's gaze. Yet she also hardened the girl with quiet lessons, how to hide fear behind silence, how to carry grief without letting it crush the breath. She did not tell Naomi that soon she must run, but her every word was a preparation for departure. 3 nights before the ball, Miriam sat alone by the kitchen hearth, the peppermint tin warm in her lap. She whispered to the flames, not prayers but names: Thomas, Lydia, Ezekiel, Clara. With each name, she tipped a measure of powder into paper, folding the edges as carefully as pastry. She felt herself not as a woman anymore, but as an instrument steel honed by years of fire. The mansion above her glittered like a cathedral of falsehood, but down in the kitchen, Miriam composed a liturgy of justice. The menu itself became prophecy: oysters steeped in cream, hams glistening with sugar, ducks drenched in spice, rice pilaf shimmering with butter. Guests would marvel at the abundance, unaware that the hand which fed them also scripted their ruin. On Christmas Eve, the house quivered with expectancy. Servants ran like startled birds, carrying trays, polishing crystal, sweeping the floors until they shone. Miriam stood at the center of the chaos, outwardly calm, inwardly ablaze. She had prepared every flavor, every mask, every lie. Tomorrow the Whitmores would dine, the governor would raise his glass, and Charleston's gilded society would taste the bitter truth hidden in their feast. The kitchen clock ticked like a metronome, each swing of the pendulum slicing away another second. The play was set, the stage decorated, the audience invited. All that remained was the final act. Christmas night arrived with the brittle chill of polished glass, the kind that cut through Charleston's harbor air and set every lantern flickering as though the city itself shivered. Carriages rattled up the Whitmore drive, wheels crunching gravel like bones, depositing Charleston's finest in silks and velvet. Music already drifted from the ballroom, a cascade of violins pouring over marble floors. For the guests, the evening promised merriment, alliances, and indulgence. For Miriam Carter, it was the culmination of nearly 3 decades of servitude and 3 weeks of silent preparation. The mansion blazed as if defying winter. Chandeliers spat light onto gowns stitched with Parisian lace. Candles crowded every surface, throwing shadows that writhed like restless souls along the walls. Jonathan Whitmore greeted each guest with exaggerated charm, a goblet in one hand, the other tugging at his waistcoat already strained by drink. Eleanor Whitmore stood poised in her silver gown, her smile sharpened into a blade honed by ambition. The governor himself, Pierce, arrived with his entourage, and whispers of opportunity swirled through the hall. Few noticed the cook standing quietly in the kitchen doorway, her apron spotless, her face unreadable. The meal began with oyster stew, creamy and steaming in porcelain bowls. Miriam oversaw its passage from kitchen to table, her eyes following Naomi, who carried trays with trembling hands. The girl's pallor betrayed exhaustion, but Miriam had forbidden her to know the true depths of the plan. Better Naomi's innocence than a confession torn under a whip. The guests praised the stew, their laughter rising with the steam. Jonathan clapped one guest on the back and declared Miriam's skill unmatched, unaware that every compliment carried her closer to vengeance. The main courses followed in procession: glazed hams, ducks roasted until their skin crackled, beef tenderloin dripping rich juices onto silver platters. Wine flowed like a river, breaking banks, staining lips crimson. Servants moved like shadows among the guests, unseen and unthanked. At the center, Miss Eleanor Sinclair, a pale girl with eyes like candle smoke, picked delicately at her plain chicken. Miriam had ensured that her dish bore the first dose, a measured portion strong enough to undo her fragile body without ending it. It was the opening note in Miriam's symphony of ruin. Minutes passed before the first cry fractured the harmony of clinking glasses. Miss Sinclair's hand flew to her mouth as her body convulsed. Her parents rose in alarm chairs, scraping hardwood as the girl bent double, retching violently. Conversation died mid-sentence, and the governor's jovial chuckle turned to a frown. Servants rushed forward with cloths and water. Dr. Alcott, present as a guest, excused himself to tend to her, and whispers buzzed like hornets. Delicate digestion, a spell of nerves. Miriam's face remained an obedient mask as she directed Naomi to fetch towels. Inside, she counted the beats, one distraction secured. When the main table settled uneasily back into its rhythm, Miriam prepared the next movement. She carried forth the flaming Christmas pudding, brandy set ablaze in blue fire, earning applause from guests, eager to forget the disruption. Behind her, Jonathan himself presented the silver punch bowl, steam of rum and fruit, curling like incense. Charleston's finest, he boasted, ladling portions into crystal cups. The governor raised his glass in anticipation, the room erupting in cheer. It was then that Miriam's hands, steady from years of slicing and seasoning, performed the quietest of betrayals. Into the goblets of Jonathan Whitmore, Overseer Parsons, Judge Wallace, and Dr. Alcott had gone an extra measure, folded from her secret paper twists. Around their rims, she had brushed the faintest dusting, invisible to the eye, impossible to wash away. They drank greedily, blind to the venom swirling in their throats. The pudding was carved plates, distributed laughter coaxed back into the room. Miriam moved among them, offering portions, bowing her head at compliments. No one saw the storm waiting beneath her calm eyes. Then came the collapse. Parsons, the overseer whose lash had painted Ezekiel's back with blood, clutched his collar and gasped. Sweat streamed down his temples as he swayed, muttering incoherently before slamming face first into his plate. Silence fell sharp as glass shattering. Judge Wallace rose to assist, but his own hands shook uncontrollably, knocking over a goblet. The heat he choked before his legs buckled. His wife screamed as he convulsed beside her, froth gathering at his lips. Dr. Alcott, abandoning his patient upstairs, rushed back only to falter mid-stride. His breathing came ragged, his eyes wide with comprehension. Poison, he croaked before collapsing onto a chair, his body trembling with futile resistance. Jonathan Whitmore, the architect of Miriam's decades of torment, staggered to his feet. He coughed violently, wine and bile splattering his waistcoat. "Help me," he rasped, grabbing at Eleanor's arm. But she too was shrieking, her gaze darting between husband and guests as chaos surged. The governor's men drew him back, forming a protective circle while panic swept the rest of the room. Ladies fainted against brocade sleeves. Gentlemen shouted for physicians, for fresh air, for escape. Chairs overturned, crystals shattered, and the once magnificent dining hall became a pit of howling confusion. Miriam watched it all as if from a distance. The chandeliers blazed above, casting a grotesque theater upon the floor, silk smeared with vomit jewels rattling loose as bodies writhed, dignity unraveling into primal fear. It was Dante's Inferno hidden beneath garlands of holly. She did not smile, but neither did she tremble. For the first time in her life, she stood equal among them, not servant, not invisible hand, but arbiter. Eleanor lunged toward her eyes, burning with accusation. "Do something," she cried, gripping Miriam's arm hard enough to bruise. "Save them." Miriam met her gaze, her voice calm as winter water. "There is nothing to be done, mistress. Their fate was sealed the moment they took what was mine. Understanding flashed in Eleanor's face like lightning, horror dawning too late. "You," she hissed, "you did this." But Jonathan's body seized in another violent convulsion, pulling her away before she could speak further. The room dissolved into pandemonium. Guests staggered for the doors, some collapsing on the marble steps outside. The governor, pale but untouched, was whisked away by his guard. Servants wailed, some cowering against walls, others fleeing outright. And still Miriam stood rooted in the doorway, a witness to her own liturgy of vengeance. When at last she turned away, the cries fading behind her, she found Naomi waiting in the kitchen with Daniel Green at her side. The girl clutched her bundle, eyes wide with fear and questions she could not voice. "Go," Miriam told them softly, pressing a gold locket into Daniel's hand. "North. Freedom waits for you." Naomi threw her arms around Miriam, sobbing into her apron. Miriam stroked her cheek, once memorizing her face. "My path is different," she whispered. "Run now. Don't look back." As they vanished into the night, slipping through the chaos toward the marsh, Miriam returned to the dining hall's edge. She looked once more upon the ruin, Jonathan writhing in bile, Parsons still as stone, Wallace twitching in death's final throes, Alcott gasping in vain. Around them, Charleston's elite wretched and wailed, their grandeur stripped away, their supremacy reduced to meat and terror. The night had fulfilled its prophecy. The banquet of power had become a feast of death, and Miriam Carter, invisible for so long, had written her name into history with a recipe no one would forget. The Whitmore mansion groaned like a wounded beast after the banquet dissolved into screams. Its windows, once brilliant with chandeliers, flickered as though the house itself fought for breath. The grand dining hall reeked of vomit and spilled wine silk gowns, stained wigs, askew power broken in a matter of minutes. Miriam Carter had walked through that chamber of ruin like a phantom, silent and composed, leaving others to flail in terror. Yet she knew vengeance was never free. Every blow against tyranny demanded a toll, and hers was already waiting to be paid. She slipped back into the kitchen where the heat of the ovens still smoldered. Naomi stood there with Daniel Green, both pale with the knowledge that the world had shifted forever. The girl clutched her bundle against her chest, eyes wet, her lips trembling with unspoken questions. Miriam touched her cheek, steady and firm. "It's time," she whispered. "You leave now." Daniel looked at her, the weight of understanding settling in his gaze. "And you?" he asked. Miriam shook her head slowly. "My road ends here. Yours begins out there. Take her north. Don't stop. Don't look back." Naomi clung to her, desperate tears soaking Miriam's apron. For a heartbeat, Miriam almost faltered, almost imagined herself walking alongside them, crossing marshes, following the stars northward, breathing air free of chains. But freedom for her lived elsewhere. She had already bound her spirit to this night. To flee would mean years of hiding, fear of capture, the inevitable reckoning of hounds and chains. At 42, with scars on her arms and fire in her veins, Miriam knew she could not carry that burden. What she had carried tonight was enough. She pressed a gold locket into Daniel's palm, the last remnant of her mother, a talisman against the dangers ahead. "This will buy silence or passage," she said. "Guard it as you guard her." Daniel nodded solemnly, clutching Naomi's hand as if to tether her to the promise of survival. Miriam embraced the girl one final time, inhaling the faint scent of smoke and flour clinging to her hair. "Remember," she murmured, "you belong to no one but yourself. Never forget it." Naomi's sobs echoed as Daniel pulled her toward the back door. Their figures vanished into the night, swallowed by the marshes where whispers of freedom threaded through the reeds. When Miriam turned back to the kitchen, the silence was overwhelming. She heard the cries from the ballroom, the desperate commands of Jonathan Whitmore gasping for air, the shrieks of Eleanor as she clutched her husband's dying body. But here, amid iron pots and wooden spoons, all was still. The kitchen, once her prison and her refuge, now stood as her sanctuary of choice. She moved to the hearth, pried loose the brick, and withdrew the peppermint tin containing what remained of the powder. She poured it into a goblet half filled with the same rum punch that had felled her oppressors. As she stirred, she thought of Thomas and Lydia, the children ripped from her arms. She imagined their faces blurred by memory yet sharp with longing. She thought of Ezekiel buried in the cold ground without ceremony, of Clara screaming as she was led away, of Naomi and Daniel now running beneath stars she herself would never follow. Each memory burned, but together they formed a strange peace. She had avenged them not with shouts or rebellion doomed to fail, but with the tools given to her, her craft, her silence, her patience. Her life had been an ingredient in their feast of power, and tonight she had turned it against them. She raised the goblet, the liquid shimmering like molten amber. The voices in the dining hall reached a fever-pitch, accusations, hurled chairs, overturned bodies collapsing onto mahogany floors. She imagined Eleanor's pale face twisting with realization, Jonathan clawing at the air for mercy that would not come. Their world was crumbling and she had lit the fuse. Miriam sipped the bitterness, cutting her tongue. It spread like fire down her throat into her chest, a burning both dreadful and cleansing. She sat beside the hearth, her body relaxing into the chair where she had once mended aprons and stitched Naomi's skirts. Flames licked the iron grate, casting shadows that seemed to dance in celebration. She closed her eyes and listened not to the chaos upstairs, but to the steady rhythm of her own breath. Each inhalation was a choice, each exhalation a farewell. Her thoughts wandered not to the masters who writhed in agony, but to the road stretching northward. She pictured Naomi walking beside Daniel, the marsh grasses parting for their passage, the night sky alive with stars guiding them onward. She imagined the moment the girl would cross into free soil, feel the ground beneath her feet no longer claim her as property. In that vision, Miriam found her own freedom, distant yet real. She had not walked the path, but she had cleared it with blood and fire. Her body grew heavy. The heat of the poison mingled with the hearth's warmth, wrapping her in a strange comfort. She thought of her mother's voice, faint as smoke, whispering songs of resilience. She thought of the root woman, old Mother Ruth, who had pressed the powder into her hand with the warning, "For the day suffering grows too wide." Miriam realized that night had finally come, and she had answered it with unwavering hand. From the hall came one final wail, Jonathan's cry broken and unrecognizable. Eleanor's sobs followed sharp as glass shattering. Miriam did not move. Their pain no longer belonged to her. For once in her life she was untouchable. She leaned back, let the goblet slip from her grasp, and felt it shatter against the stone floor, its stain mingling with soot and ash. The poison gripped her swiftly. Her pulse quickened, her vision blurred. Yet even as her breath shortened, calmness held her. She was no longer servant, no longer victim, no longer invisible. She was a woman who had written her ending with her own hands, who had dared to tip the scales of justice in a world that denied her humanity. When the authorities stormed into the mansion minutes later, they found chaos in the ballroom, dead and dying, sprawled across carpets, Charleston's finest reduced to flesh and bile. In the kitchen, they discovered Miriam slumped beside the hearth, her face serene, her body already cooling. To them, she was merely evidence, a cautionary tale, another entry in the city's records. But to those who would whisper her story in secret quarters, she was something far greater. And so Miriam Carter paid her price. Freedom did not come in the form of escape, but in the form of finality, a sacrifice etched into Charleston's memory. Her life ended in the very room where she had been chained for decades, yet her spirit walked with Naomi and Daniel into the night. The cost had been terrible, but the reckoning was complete. By morning, Charleston wore its grief like a borrowed veil, loud in the papers, quiet in the streets. Printers inked the headline before the dew had dried: Christmas poisoning at the Whitmore House, prominent figures struck down. Clerks tallied the dead. Officials spoke of safeguards and stricter controls over those who cooked and cleaned the tables of power. They wrote Miriam Carter as a caution, sullen, secretive, ungrateful. They did not write the names of Thomas or Lydia, nor the lash on Ezekiel's back, nor a little girl called Clara, sold to balance a debt. History prefers its ledgers neat. But behind kitchens and quarters in whispers, braided through dusk, a different record took shape. Miriam's name moved like a lantern in the dark, steady and precise. She became parable in prayer, a hand on a shoulder when courage faltered, a vow spoken over simmering pots. We are not invisible if we can choose the ending. Far north, Naomi and Daniel learned the discipline of freedom, new names, hard work, fear that dimmed but never died. Some nights they stood beneath winter stars and traced their path backward to a kitchen hearth, to a woman who traded her body for a future she would not see. They kept her locket, and with it, an oath to spend their days enlarging the world she opened. If this story finds you, if it troubles, steadies, or burns, help us keep the flame. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Shadows only thin when many hands carry the light.